Welcome back to our Fundamentals of Nutrition channel. Today we're going to talk about the scientific method. The scientific method is a way that we gather evidence around nutrition so we can answer our burning nutrition questions. Questions that you might have or that you might get from friends and family. Things like, is chocolate good for me? Should I be a vegan? What's the best way for me to feel like I have the most energy? All of those types of questions are really important, and they're answered by gathering scientific evidence using the scientific method. So what are the steps of the scientific method? Let's find out. So the scientific method, the first step is that you ask a question. So let's use this question as our overarching question. Is eating ice cream healthy for me? Let's say that you really want to figure out if that is true or false because you really love ice cream, perhaps. So that's our first step. The second step is to make a hypothesis or prediction. A hypothesis is just what you think will happen, and hypotheses are usually based on previous information that you know or your personal experience even, but usually based on previous research that might point you a certain direction. So my hypothesis to our question, is eating ice cream healthy for you? My hypothesis is people who eat ice cream every day will be happier and have better markers of metabolic health, like their blood cholesterol, their blood sugar, than those who don't. So I'm really going all in and saying that eating ice cream every day is going to make you happier, so your mental health will be better, and it's going to make you metabolically healthier, so your physical health will be better. And I may have based this on previous research that I've done, or I may just want to believe that this is true. It's better to base on previous research, but a hypothesis is just a prediction. Our third step then is to conduct an experiment. And there's really 4 types of research experiments that are commonly used in nutrition. The first type is a lab study, and we're going to talk about each of these types going forward. A lab study, then we have a case study, an epidemiological study, or an intervention study. So let's talk a little bit more about each of these types and how they might work for our ice cream question. If you're doing a lab study, you might have 2 groups, usually of animals, and in this case, mice. So you have one group of mice, and then a second group of mice, same type of mice. And so what you might do is for one of the groups, you might feed that group 3 servings of ice cream every single day. The other group might get no ice cream every day, and you might monitor the mice for 3-6 months, something like that. And at the end of your time period, you're going to ask yourself, and you're going to do measures with the mice to figure out which group of mice are happier, which group of mice have better metabolic health. There's ways you can measure mouse happiness, and then you can take blood cholesterol, you can look at the hearts of the mice, you can look at the blood sugar response of the mice to figure out their metabolic health. Oftentimes we see nutrition studies in mice when doing them in humans is not really feasible yet, or where you might have to really look at the inside of a heart or another organ where you can't really cut a human up to do that. And I know there's animal rights issues with lab-based research, so some people really don't like to do that, but we do find out a lot of fundamentally important nutrition information from lab studies in animals. But one thing to remember with that is that animals are not the same as humans. So just because something is proven to be true in an animal does not 100% mean it will then be true in a human. So lab studies are important, but they're not the be-all end-all of figuring out how a nutrient is going to impact a human. The second type of study that you might do is a case study. So in a case study, you really usually follow one individual. So here's an individual, it looks like she likes ice cream. So you recruit this individual and you feed this individual 3 ice cream cones every day for 6 months. So you're talking about one person and she's eating all this ice cream for 6 months. And then you ask after 6 months, is she happier than she was at the beginning? And does she have better metabolic health than she did at the beginning? So you might give her a psychological questionnaire to determine her happiness, and you might look at her blood sugar and her blood cholesterol to determine her metabolic health, measures like that. But what you have to remember is that you've only used one individual. So even if you find that she is happier after eating ice cream every day for 6 months, that might not apply to a larger population. Really important to keep in mind with a case study. So case studies can alert us to kind of interesting findings or unique findings, but they don't always apply across a population. The epidemiological studies look at a whole population, and you can really define the population however you want. So it could be a population of UVM students, it could be a population of Vermonters, it could be a population of the whole United States. So in this case, we're looking at the whole United States, and often in an epidemiological study, they might administer a survey to everybody they can, or a sample population in the United States. So they'll randomly choose Americans to send surveys to. You may have been involved in an epidemiological study before, or a political study that operates in a similar way, where they send you a survey or they ask you your thoughts. So you send a survey to everybody in America and you ask, how much ice cream do you eat? How happy are you? And what health conditions do you have? And so then they send the surveys back and you figure out associations between how much ice cream people are eating and their happiness and their metabolic health. So you might find that people who eat the most ice cream are different than people who eat the least ice cream. And you might compare then those who eat the most with those who eat the least. But what's really important is that you have to realize, and this is like jump up and down important, any associations you find between who eats the most ice cream and their happiness or healthiness, that is a correlation, that is an association. It does not mean you did not find that eating ice cream causes you to be happier with an epidemiological study. That's just not possible in that type of study, because what could have happened if you found that people who eat the most ice cream, those people were associated with happier and healthier outcomes, there could be other factors involved there. So there, in that relationship that the arrow is indicating that there's this relationship between people who eat the most ice cream and being happy and healthy, there's other things at work. So they could be of a different socioeconomic status, they could have different education levels, they could be of different ages, sex could be at work. They could be eating a certain kind of ice cream. There could be doing other diet and health habits that impact this relationship you found between eating the most ice cream and being happy and healthy. So in an epidemiological study, you have to really try to control for those variables, and there's statistical techniques you can use to try to do that. But you'll never be able to say from that type of study design that eating ice cream causes you to be happy and healthy. If you want to look at causation, you really need to do what's called an intervention study. Groups, and you do this randomly. So the groups are randomly assigned. Whether you're in group 1 or group 2 is usually assigned by a computer. And because you've randomly assigned this larger group of people to these two groups, you can assume that there are no fundamental differences on average between the two groups. So their education level should be similar, their SES status should be similar, the racial ethnicity breakdown of the groups should be similar, the sex breakdown should be similar. So they should be able to be compared because all of the factors, the individual factors between the groups are kind of eliminated as factors because of this random assignment. So then you can take the two groups, and group 1, you might feed them 3 ice cream cones a day. Group 2, you might say you're not getting ice cream at all, and then you monitor them over 6 months. At the end of 6 months, you then look at the data, and you might find the same thing you found in an epidemiological study, that people who eat the most ice cream are happier and metabolically healthier. But because you did this randomization to the groups, and then you did a controlled intervention where you monitored if people were eating ice cream 3 times a day or not at all, you can then say that people who ate the most ice cream, it seemed to cause them to be happier and healthier. So in an intervention study, you can establish causation. So they're really hard to do correctly, but they're very powerful because of their ability to establish causation on different nutrition issues. So now that we've talked about intervention studies, and I'm telling you they're a great way to find out causal relationships between a nutrient, eating a certain dietary pattern, and a health outcome, you might be wondering, why don't we always do intervention studies? And the issue is because many nutrition questions are so hard to answer through intervention studies because of the way the study has to be set up. So let's think about if you want to figure out if eating saturated fat is going to lead to more heart disease down the road. Many people have tried to figure this out, but if you want to do a true intervention study to try to answer this question, you would have to randomize into 2 groups, and then you would feed a certain level of saturated fat to one group, maybe a lesser level to another group, and then you would have to make sure that every day the people in those groups are eating the correct amount of saturated fat, and after that you would have to monitor them for like 20, 40 years, the time it would necessarily take to develop a health outcome like heart disease. And so you're gonna have a really hard time getting people to volunteer to be in a dietary intervention study where they can't eat their own food. They have to eat the food you've provided them so that they're eating the right amount of saturated fat for 40 years. So that's almost impossible to do, both by getting volunteers and having enough money to do the study. And that's why a lot of nutrition research is not done in that kind of intervention study way. It's done in a more epidemiological way to try to get the best answers we can in a sustainable fashion. But it's this underlying issue to many nutrition studies that they can't be done and in an intervention way, and so they can't figure out these causal relationships. So after we've done whatever type of experiment we decide to do, we're going to analyze the results. In this case, all of our experiments tended to say that those who ate ice cream every day were happier and had better markers of metabolic health. And then we're going to accept or reject our hypothesis. Well, our hypothesis was very wishful thinking, and we thought that people who ate ice cream would be happier and healthier. And in this case, we have a confirmed hypothesis, which leads us to the last step of the scientific method, where we ask a new question. So we now know that ice cream might cause people to be, or might be associated with people being happier and healthier. But I might have a new question, like, does eating vegan ice cream have the same impact on happiness and metabolic health as eating dairy-based ice cream? And then I start the process all over again, and I analyze my questions. That's the 6th step, but a really important part of the scientific method is publishing your findings. And so you publish your findings in scientific journal articles. These are the type of journal articles that are reviewed by other scientists. So you have to submit your article and your findings to be reviewed by other people in your field. And then if they have feedback, they'll give you feedback. You'll revise the article, and you can eventually publish it if it's deemed basically worthy of publication. As you can see, this is an article from one of my students who did an ice cream study, kind of like we have talked about here, looking at people's perceptions of vegan versus non-dairy ice cream. And it was published in the journal Food Quality and Preference. So sharing your findings with the scientific community and then hopefully with the greater public is a really important part of the scientific method. And that is also where some of the messages can get really screwed up. So if a publication goes to just summarize your scientific findings and then share them on like the Today Show or a newspaper or a magazine article, sometimes they can make the findings seem flashier or more exciting than they actually were, or they'll take rat findings and say that the same is true in humans. So we need to be voraciously critical consumers of media interpretations of science and also even of journal publications of science. You need to be a critical reader. And I'm going to link below to a clip from John Oliver on his show Last Week Tonight, where he talks about some of the issues involved in sketchy science and relating science from publication to the general public, which is a really important part of science. It's how people figure out what nutrition messages to follow or not. It's usually because some form of media is telling them something about it. Not very many people go to a registered dietitian for their nutrition advice, even though that would be ideal. But we need to know how to critically consume science as people questing for better health. All right, so that's a wrap on the scientific method. We've talked about how scientists go about collecting evidence to answer burning nutrition questions. So when you're looking for answers to your burning nutrition questions, make sure that you're looking at science that has followed the steps of the scientific method, been reviewed by other scientists, published in reputable journals, and then you can apply that information to your life. All right, see you next time. Click below for relevant links and more information on the scientific method. Later.